Well, good afternoon to you all. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the background of the initiative and also where we might end up. Edi was a little bit pessimistic and is hoping that at least we sort out the DCC issue. We will have at least one other thing, namely cross-border transaction fees aligned with domestic fees, also for countries which don't have the euro. This seems to be consensual. But let's go back. The Consumer Financial Services Action Plan was mentioned already by you, John. There we had two actions. One was to extend the principle of this Regulation 924/2009 on cross-border transaction charges to all currencies. And then we had, as a second action, rather non-committal, the idea that we should explore ways of tackling consumer detriment caused by DCC. We did a thorough impact assessment for this first action, namely to extend the scope of Regulation 924/2009. And we did realize that most cross-border transactions are actually done in euro. And we also asked our consultant to work out how much it costs to do cross-border transactions. And we found that the cost of cross-border transactions in euro, also for non-euro country, can be quite low, whereas for non-euro currencies, cross-border transactions can be quite expensive because they have to be handled manually. We need correspondent banking and so on. If we required the alignment of costs for domestic and cross-border transactions for non-euro transactions, that would have been a heavy burden on banks and for a small proportion of transactions, actually. So at the end of the the impact assessment, we came to the conclusion that we should focus on euro transactions and align the cost of cross-border euro transactions not with domestic euro transactions, which don't exist or are very uncommon in non-euro countries. And that's already in force today, this alignment. It applies to all member states, euro or non-euro. But we want to align it with the cost of domestic transaction in any currency, also non-euro currencies. So we would have cheap cross-border euro transactions for everybody. And that's something which is not controversial. What would be controversial would be an extension of this principle to all currencies, as we had envisaged in the Consumer Financial Services Action Plan. But we have moved away from that already in the Commission proposal. Then when we submitted our proposal to our impact assessment rather, to the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, the Impact Assessment Board as it was known previously, they asked, but what are you going to do about the risk that banks might recoup their lost revenues, the billion euros we may save as consumers, by raising the cost of currency conversion? So we had to go back to the drawing board and think about that. And then at that time also, you convinced your boss to go and see my boss and tell him that this legislative proposal we were working on, and where we had to add the dimension cross-border currency conversion, would be a good opportunity to tackle also DCC. We had lower ambitions initially, namely just to study the issue. So we thought, yeah, it's worth a try. Let's go for it and introduce some transparency requirements for currency conversion. But this had not been properly assessed in the impact assessment. So we thought, given that this can be quite technical, we will ask the European Banking Authority to do a proper consultation of the market on how we can achieve more transparency at those places where people have to decide what currency conversion option they want to use. In the shops, in the hotel, at the airport, in front of the ATM, or online. So we wanted to get EBA to do this work, and because that takes time and because there may be adaptations to the payments infrastructure needed afterwards, we thought it would be a good idea to have a cap so that consumers can benefit from some protection against abusively high charges for currency conversion in a very near future. that is our text, which went to the council. The council worked very fast, kicked out the mandate for the EBA, which is unlikely to be brought back in by the parliament, but left at least a requirement for the EBA to produce a report on how currency conversion operates following the adoption of these amendments to Regulation 924. That could then be the basis for further adjustments to the legislation if needed. Then, as far as currency conversion is concerned, the scope was rather limited to just DCC situations, and with the idea that the absolute amount, the cost would have to be presented in an absolute amount, which could be a little bit tricky. Our view would have been rather to present it as a percentage markup over the ECB rate, and that's something which is still under discussion, and that could be used for any currency conversion situation. The only complication is fixed charges, which would of course then mean that the markup rate would vary depending on the amount involved in the currency conversion. Now the European Parliament has designated a rapporteur, Eva Meidel, who presented a report with some proposals for amendments. They were discussed in the Econ Committee, I think on the 29th of August, and the deadline was set for amendments, and that deadline was the 14th of September. The amendments are there, but not yet public. We had lots of contacts with various stakeholders who have also been speaking to members of the European Parliament. So we will end up with more than 100 amendments for those two articles, which is not bad per article. But I mean, what emerges from that is that the principle of equalizing the cost of cross-border transactions in euro with all costs of cross-border transactions in any currency should be equal with the cost of domestic transactions. That seems to be a tendency prevailing in the European Parliament. Maybe it's a negotiating stance to get something else in exchange for it, because it's probably not going to fly with the Council. But this might be the position, the starting position for the European Parliament. We also have perhaps more, a little bit stronger requirements for dynamic currency conversion, where there are different proposals for tackling that with proactive ways of informing consumers. Berg initiated perhaps an idea or planted an idea which would, but you will present it perhaps yourself. The possibility of blocking DCC. I'll give you the possibility to develop this idea. There are also amendments concerning the cross-border transactions part, where a distinction could be made between credit transfers and card payments. When you do card payments abroad, you don't necessarily know whether there will be fixed charges. This is an issue which was brought to our attention by London Transport. They want to encourage transport users to use their contactless cards. But they cannot do it with a clean conscience if foreign visitors would have to pay not just the trip, but on top of that a fixed charge, which would make it more expensive to use a contactless card than to use the Oyster card. So they would have liked to see an equalization of currency transaction costs, transaction costs for cards domestically and abroad. So it basically would mean that if domestically there are no fixed charges, abroad, you shouldn't face fixed charges either. So that could be an interesting development, but we have to see whether this makes it into the final, something like this makes it into the final position of the Parliament. As I said, no mandate for EBA. I don't know whether there will be a report for the EBA that could be brought back in by the Council in the negotiations. But I think we are moving towards something which allows us to make progress, certainly on cross-border transaction charges. And I think there will also be strong support for tackling DCC issues. How we are going to get more transparency for any cross-border, for any currency conversion remains to be seen. Hopefully it could be something on the basis of costs being expressed as a markup over the ECB